What if I told you there's a mother who juggled 3 jobs for over 20 years, who pawned her jewelry, her dreams, even her house, all to give her children a better life, and that in the end, when she needed them most, they simply vanished? This isn't a work of fiction. This is the true story of Margaret, a woman who learned in the most gut-wrenching way possible that sometimes unconditional love isn't reciprocated in kind. But what happened next will strike a chord with you in a way you'll never forget. Brace yourselves, because in the next few minutes, you're about to encounter a story that will fundamentally shift your perspective on what family truly means. Stick around until the very end, because the twist in this tale is nothing short of astonishing. If you've ever experienced something similar, or know someone who has, drop a heart in the comments. And if this is your first time here, welcome to our community. You've landed in exactly the right spot. Margaret was barely 19 when she became a mother for the first time. David was born in a small country town, and from the very moment she cradled him in her arms, she knew she'd do anything, absolutely anything, to give him a better life than the one she'd endured. David's father disappeared before the boy even turned 2. Margaret found herself utterly alone, without a completed formal education, and no family to lean on. But instead of succumbing to despair, she made a silent vow. Her children would never go through what she had. They would never know hunger. They would never feel abandoned. They would never question if they were loved. 2 years later, Sarah arrived. Then Thomas. Margaret was now a single mother of 3 before she hit 25. While other women her age were discovering themselves, socializing with friends, building careers, Margaret was waking at 4 a.m. to clean offices before her children stirred. But one job wasn't enough. It was never enough. By day, she worked at a local diner, serving sandwiches and coffee to blue-collar workers who often earned in a day what she made in a week. By night, after the children were finally asleep, she'd sew clothes for neighbors, mend garments, take on any manual labor that could bring in a few extra dollars. Extras. Margaret had never bought a new outfit for herself. She'd never been to the cinema. She'd never had a romantic date. Every penny that came into the house was meticulously portioned out. Food, rent, clothes for the children, school supplies. She wore the same 3 dresses for years, danced so many times they barely resembled their original forms. When David turned 10, he wanted a bicycle, not just any bicycle, but the gleaming red one he'd seen in the toy shop window. Margaret didn't have the money, but she had one thing: her mother's graduation ring, the only heirloom she possessed. Without a second thought, she sold it. The joy on David's face when he unwrapped that bicycle on Christmas morning was worth every tear she shed in secret that night. Sarah wanted piano lessons. Margaret took on a 4th job, cleaning houses on weekends. Thomas wanted to play soccer. She baked and sold cakes to fund his uniform and team fees. Each of her children's dreams became her personal mission. The years passed in a blur of work, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Margaret aged rapidly. At 35, she looked 50. Her hands were perpetually rough from constant labor. Her back ached perpetually from carrying the weight of multiple jobs. But her children were growing up healthy, bright, full of opportunities she herself had never known. David graduated high school with flying colors. Margaret cried with pride at his graduation. She'd worked double shifts for weeks to buy his suit and still managed to get some professional photos taken. Sarah showed real musical talent and was accepted into a music conservatory. Thomas was a natural athlete and received scholarship offers. Every one of their achievements was a victory for her. Every smile, every trophy, every word of praise from teachers. It all justified every pre-dawn working hour, every meal she skipped so they could eat better, every personal dream she'd shelved. Margaret never complained. She never made her children feel guilty for the sacrifices. To them, their mother's dedication was simply normal. This was what mothers did, they thought. This was how families worked. When David got accepted into university, Margaret sold the car, the only car she had managed to afford in 20 years of working. She went back to public transport, to long walks, but David would have his university education. Did Sarah need a better piano? Margaret borrowed money, promising to repay it with extra work. Did Thomas want to compete in an interstate championship? She found a way. At 45, Margaret finally believed she had made it. Her 3 children were successful young adults, educated, with infinite opportunities ahead of them. She had kept her promise. She had broken the cycle of poverty and neglect that had marked her own childhood. It was time, she thought, to finally look after herself a little. Perhaps return to study. Perhaps find someone to share her life with. Perhaps, finally, discover who Margaret was when she wasn't just mum. But life, as she would soon discover, had other plans. If you're a mum or a dad, you know exactly what I'm talking about, don't you? That urge to give everything, to sacrifice without a second thought. Comment below. What's the biggest sacrifice you've ever made for your kids? The first crack in the perfect world Margaret had built began subtly. David, now graduated and with a well-paying job in a big city, started to space out his calls. First, there were weekly calls that became fortnightly, then monthly, then silence. Margaret initially rationalized. He was busy building his career. It was natural for a young adult to want independence. She had raised strong, independent children. That was a good thing, wasn't it? But when she called David, the conversations became shorter, more distant. He seemed irritated by her questions about how he was eating, if he was happy, if he needed anything. "Mum, I'm fine. You don't need to worry so much," he'd say, in a tone she'd never heard before, a tone that made her feel like an inconvenience. Sarah was next. After graduating from music school, she moved to the other side of the country to pursue an artistic career. Daily calls became weekly, then sporadic. When Margaret called, Sarah often didn't pick up. When she did, she was always rushing somewhere or in the middle of something important. Margaret started to question herself. Was she being suffocating? Had she raised her children the wrong way, making them feel too obligated to her? She decided to give them more space, call less, wait for them to reach out. They didn't. Thomas was the final blow. Always the closest to her, always the one who showed the most affection, he secured a full scholarship to a prestigious university. Margaret was beaming with pride. On the day he left, she hugged him tightly and said, "You're my baby, no matter how big you get." Thomas smiled, but there was something different in his eyes. Something she couldn't identify at the time, but would later recognize as shame. The first few months at university, Thomas still called regularly, but the conversations shifted. He no longer wanted to talk about home, about the neighborhood, about the people they knew. When Margaret mentioned she missed him, he'd changed the subject swiftly. When she asked when he was coming to visit, he always had excuses: exams, projects, social commitments. It was during one of these infrequent calls that Margaret overheard voices in the background. Young people laughing, music playing. It was obvious Thomas was with friends. "Who are you with, darling?" she asked, genuinely interested in meeting her son's new friends. There was a pause. A long, uncomfortable pause. "Oh, just some uni mates," Thomas replied, his voice sounding odd. Margaret heard a female voice in the background ask, "Who is it?" And then she heard the answer that shattered her heart. "Nobody important. Just someone from back home." Nobody important. She, who had dedicated every breath of her life to him, was nobody important. Margaret hung up the phone in a daze. Surely she'd misheard. Surely her son, her baby, hadn't just denied her existence to his friends. But deep down, she knew she'd heard him perfectly. The years that followed were a slow, painful awakening. Margaret realized her children hadn't just drifted physically, they had drifted emotionally. More than that, they seemed ashamed of their origins, ashamed of her. David, now living in a luxurious apartment, posted photos on social media with well-dressed friends, at expensive restaurants, on international trips. He never mentioned his family. He never posted throwback photos. It was as if the first 18 years of his life, the years Margaret had poured entirely into him, simply didn't exist. Sarah, too, had reinvented her story. In interviews for music blogs, she spoke of overcoming adversity and finding her own way, but always vaguely, as if she'd grown up in a vacuum, without mentioning the mother who worked 3 jobs to pay for her piano lessons. Thomas was perhaps the most painful of all. When he brought his first serious girlfriend home, Margaret noticed how he apologized for the simple house, the old furniture, the home-cooked food she had lovingly prepared. He invented stories about his childhood, downplaying the poverty, creating a more palatable version of his origins. Margaret began to understand a devastating truth. She had given her children everything they needed for a better life, but in doing so, they had learned to be ashamed of where they came from. The mother who had saved them from poverty was now an uncomfortable reminder of a past they would rather forget. Visits became increasingly rare. On holidays, there were always excuses: work, other commitments, travel. When they did come, it was for a few hours, and Margaret could feel their impatience, their haste to leave, their reluctance to be there. She became a ghost in her own children's lives. Those 3 human beings for whom she had sacrificed everything now treated her like an inconvenient obligation, an embarrassing relic of a past they had outgrown. Margaret was 52 when she finally admitted to herself a truth that shattered her. She had raised children who didn't love her. Worse still, she had raised children who were ashamed of her. I know this is difficult to hear. Perhaps you're thinking about your own parents right now, or your children. The question that remains is, how did we get to this point? How can unconditional love morph into indifference? Stay with me, because what happens next will completely surprise you. Margaret spent the next 2 years in a spiral of depression and self-questioning. She had spent her entire life being mum, and now, with no children who recognized her as such, she no longer knew who she was. She stopped tending to the house with the same zeal. She stopped cooking the elaborate meals she always made, even knowing no one would come to eat them. She stopped, in many ways, living. It was during this dark period that something unexpected happened. Margaret was in hospital for a routine checkup when she met Elena, a young nurse who had just graduated. Elena was an immigrant, alone in the country, struggling to establish herself while sending money back to family overseas. Something in the quiet determination of Elena had touched Margaret profoundly. Perhaps it was the recognition of herself in a younger iteration. Perhaps it was simply the basic human need to nurture someone. Margaret initially offered small gestures of kindness, a home-cooked lunch for Elena to take to work, practical advice about city living, a listening ear for the young woman's struggles. Elena, initially surprised by the kindness of a stranger, gradually opened up and began to deeply value these interactions. It was Elena who first called Margaret a heart mother. It was Elena who began visiting her regularly, who called to check in, who genuinely cared about her well-being. Through Elena, Margaret met other young people in similar circumstances. Marcus, a university student who had aged out of the social care system and had no family. Sophia, a young single mother struggling to balance work and motherhood. James, a war veteran who had lost touch with his family. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Margaret began to rebuild her identity. Not as the biological mother who had been rejected, but as a maternal figure for those who truly needed and valued her love. She started a small support group in her home. Every week, her chosen children would gather for home-cooked dinners, heartfelt conversations, and the kind of unconditional support that Margaret had always given, but which was now received with genuine gratitude rather than taken for granted. Margaret discovered something surprising. She was good at this. Not just at nurturing, but at mentoring, at supporting, at helping young adults navigate life's challenges. All those decades of experience, all that love that had been rejected by her own children, now had a new and profound purpose. Elena graduated from postgraduate studies and secured a position at a prestigious hospital. Marcus finished university with honors and landed his dream job. Sophia found stability and confidence as a mother. James began to heal his emotional wounds. And all of them credited Margaret as a foundational force in their achievements. The truly surprising twist came 3 years later. during what was meant to be a simple birthday celebration for Margaret. Her chosen children had organized a surprise party. The house was filled with laughter, genuine love, and palpable gratitude. That's when the doorbell rang. At the door stood David, Sarah, and Thomas. All three of them, together, for first time in years. Thomas was the first to speak, his eyes brimming with tears. "Mum, we heard about what you've been up to. Elena works at the same hospital as David's girlfriend, and she told us." Margaret remained silent, unsure how to respond. David continued, "We found out about the support group, about how you've been helping all these people. And we realized we've never thanked you for everything you've done for us." Sarah, openly weeping, added, "We spent so much time trying to forget where we came from that we forgot to appreciate who brought us here." But Margaret, surprisingly, didn't feel the explosive joy she had imagined for years. Instead, she felt a profound calm and a crystalline clarity. "I love you," she said simply. "I will always love you. You are my children, and nothing will change that. But I've learned something important. Love shouldn't be a debt. And gratitude shouldn't be coerced by guilt." She looked around the room, at Elena, Marcus, Sophia, James, and all the others who had become her true family. "I've found my purpose. I've found people who value what I have to offer, not because they feel obligated, but because they choose to." What followed was beautiful and painful all at once. David, Sarah, and Thomas embarked on a long process of rebuilding their relationship with Margaret. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always linear. There were difficult conversations about hurt, pride, expectations, and love. But Margaret had changed. She was no longer waiting for them to fill the void in her life. She had built a fulfilling life for herself, surrounded by people who chose her as much as she had chosen them. Today, at 62, Margaret has healthy relationships with her 3 biological children. Relationships built on mutual respect and conscious choice, not obligation or guilt. But her greatest joy comes from her extended family. Over 20 young adults she has mentored over the years, many of whom now have families of their own and are passing on the values they learned from her to the next generation. Margaret learned that true love isn't about sacrificing yourself to the point of depletion. It's about giving wisely, setting healthy boundaries, and recognizing that sometimes the greatest gift we can give our children is the permission for them to be who they are, even if that doesn't include being grateful of. Margaret's story really got me thinking about what family and unconditional love truly mean. If her story resonated with you in any way, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, perhaps a mum going through something similar, or even a child who needs a different perspective, please share this video with them. Sometimes, the stories we need to hear most find us in the most unexpected ways. Until the next video, and remember, true love always finds a way, even when it's not the way we expected.